Junk food, a very broad and crude classification. One person's definition of junk food might differ from another person's. Is a donut a junk food? But what about a burger? What if it's an organic, homemade burger? It is difficult to make an all-encompassing video and pretend that all junk foods are the same. They're not. Generally speaking, these tend to be calorie-dense, ultra-processed and hyperpalatable. Hyperpalatable is a posh word for fucking delicious. And of course, when you combine high calorie and fucking delicious, foods tend to be easier to consume in large quantities. Consuming 1,000 calories from a very tasty cake is going to be a lot easier than consuming 1,000 calories worth of plain potatoes, or 1,000 calories from strawberries. Most people would agree that consuming a diet very high in these foods isn't likely to be best for health or body composition. That being said, some common advice is for you to avoid these foods altogether. There are various views for this psychology. Any paleo diets which strictly exclude processed foods, and clean eating psychology which often banishes these foods altogether. But what are some all-encompassing truths that we can apply here? Highly processed, calorie-dense foods tend to be less satiating, which is another word for filling. Baked foods that are high in fat and added sugars are likely to be less filling than foods with naturally occurring sugars like fruit. Highly processed foods, defined as having additional fat and/or refined carbohydrates, are associated with addictive-like behaviours such as loss of control. On average, ultra-processed foods are easier to consume more of. One trial compared an ultra-processed diet to an unprocessed diet, and the ultra-processed diet resulted in weight gain. Although this weight gain was in line with the additional calorie consumption, it didn't conclude that ultra-processed foods were inherently fattening as such. So delicious calorie-dense foods like pizza, ice cream, donuts, cakes, etc. are likely to be less satiating, easier to consume more of, and maybe more difficult to control from a food portion perspective. Hence the notion of addictive-like foods. With all that being said, common advice is to avoid these foods altogether. After all, if they are very high in calories and very low in nutrients, why bother eating them? I mean, this advice sounds very simple, right? But it isn't that simple. It would be simple if those foods were never invented in the first place, but they are, and we are becoming increasingly surrounded by them with a growing presence on supermarket shelves. And that makes strictly avoiding them a little bit more complicated. If you tell someone that they have to strictly avoid eating certain foods, this may paradoxically make their diet more difficult to stick to. For example, how many people do you know who strictly avoid certain foods when they're dieting, but then find themselves binge eating that food periodically? It's a little bit like if you refused to eat a single slice of pizza per day, but every Saturday you ate 10 slices. If that happens, was depriving yourself in the first place actually productive? Or avoiding the occasional glass of wine, but then drinking yourself into oblivion every Saturday night. I actually ate less junk food when I stopped having cheat meals and just cut myself a little bit more slack. And this forms the basis of the flexible dieting ethos. If including some more indulgent foods into your nutrition plan helps from a psychological adherence perspective, whilst minimizing the likelihood that you're going to binge eat that food, that must be a good thing, right? So generally speaking, it makes sense to prioritize nutritious, unprocessed foods as much as possible. I don't really know anyone who would disagree with that. But the more common argument is whether someone needs to avoid junk food like the plague. I don't believe that giving people a blanket ban on junk food is helpful. I think it makes sense to include it at an appropriate level for you. And in some instances, strict avoidance could be doing more harm than good.